welcome everyone. This is meant for you to have the opportunity to, get nitty gritty, get the details that if you weren't able to get some answers from the modular, this is the time to continue the discussion in great detail. So I know we kind of left certain things unsaid. So if anyone has a question before I kick in, just raise your hand. Or
I don't know if Adam is here, but there was a guy called Adam, a person called Adam in the chat in the last session who was making a point, a really clever point, I thought, about ontological change of, in the sense what I think he meant was that variable font creates the possibility or suggests the possibility that typography might be able to move entirely away from a mechanical model, in the sense that we all think about typography because of a movable type model going back to Korea, I think, 1000 AD. And in a sense that sets up the idea that characters are repeatable, repeatable elements that may be bold or maybe italic or whatever, but they're kind of mirroring writing and speech broadly. And I think what he was getting at was how can typography become like handwriting, but a digital, but an automated version of it. In that if it can vary in all these axes, multiple Z axes, I think one of the panelists said, then can it actually become like handwriting in that it's continuously altering? And I thought it was a fascinating idea because, in a sense, the way that metal type was kind of put on hold by photo setting and digital type, does this kind of completely leapfrog metal type or movable type? Anyway, if that makes sense. That makes sense.
It does, and there are, I know at least a few people who will have seen what I'm going to reference, but the guys from the Underwear Foundry have a bunch of stuff that they've been working on over the past few years, and it's leveraging variable font technology, but it's really going way further. And so grammatography is what they call it. And essentially it's a 3-stroke character that has all these variation axes, and it can basically create virtually any letter form. And they've really taken some of these concepts so much further than really, I think, anybody else in the world. And it's absolutely fascinating. And it is very much in that same vein. So you can see some demos. Underwear is UNDERWARE. So I know that's kind of that's a tricky Google search to not get wrong, but it's utterly fascinating stuff. And you really have to see, I mean, it deals with handwriting to the level of like ink spread. I mean, it's really, think of time being one of the axes. And so that's one of the things that I was actually showing in some earlier talks, was some samples that they had given me of their bellow typeface, but they've taken it way further than that. So that actually gets into something really fascinating when you see how they apply it to a language like Chinese, where the stroke order in which you write it is integral to the meaning of what you're writing, and they can actually dictate that. And so you have a font that actually can become a writing teaching tool. So, I mean, we're just at the very beginning of what variable fonts might do to transform education, to transform communication. I mean, I like fiddle around with the edges of this by doing things like scale type mathematically. So on the web, I'm very often not concerned at all with what the specific point sizes are or pixel sizes, because I just know what I want the small end to be and the large end for headings and body copy and line height, and let those things scale based on the width of the screen.
Jason,
I think
I mean, I could keep going.
Well, no, it's good that you should keep going, but I think the other step that's going to happen, I think eventually, is machine-based learning. When our machines are going to learn what variable fonts are doing, and the machines are going to start to create, as we do now with the variable fonts. Could you imagine the machine now understanding what a variable font is?
And also, sorry to interrupt you, Gloria, but could a machine effectively then have its own handwriting?
I don't know. Interestingly enough, Public Foundry, the three, I think they're going to be talking next Tuesday on our London Calling series, 10 a.m. Pacific time, and we'll give you that information. They're based in London, and they got a Google Research grant to talk about machine-based learning in creating type from street vernacular fonts. So it's fascinating because I agree, David, I think, will they have their own handwriting? It's, can you teach, or can the machine learn to write and write individually?
Yeah, I think another thing that you can look at is actually to help kind of wrap one's heads around possibilities is going back to like open type scripting with contextual alternates. And it's very much more controlled, but and it's nothing new. But I think oftentimes the view of it has been, you know, to be very noticeable, be very you know, like I said, creative and whatnot. But I actually think you can start to think about how characters relate with one another, not on so much of a kind of a gratuitous manner, but in a way that they can function better together to create a more effective line or more effective read. You know, just understanding like there's certain challenges and when pairing like a lowercase r with a lowercase Roman a, with the abundance of counter space, the conflict that could happen there at the X height, that if you start to think about, well, you know, having all that abundance of counter space is just the way it's going to be, or is there a way to design around that or offer up an alternative? You know, it very labor intensive. It's not so spontaneous or based upon parameters, and things can kind of take care of itself. But I think as well is just that kind of learning. One can learn a lot just working through that idea and in that more controlled environment, so to speak.
I was just looking for the link to pass along, but one of the things that I thought was really fascinating was some of the young designers at Occupant Fonts with Cyrus Highsmith here in Providence have been working on machine learning kerning, and using something like that over time to help reduce some of the manual effort. But I think it really does play into that notion of creating a unique style that might grow and evolve over time. You know, I don't know that it's not the same as an individual person doing these things by eye, but I think that's okay. That these things can complement each other and they can diverge. I think somebody put in the chat, like, what does you know, what does serious handwriting look like? And you know, I think this is like a really interesting notion of these things evolving over time to a machine or a system having its own particular style.
Not so strange. If you've ever used QuarkXPress, it's definitely got its own style, hasn't it?
I saw when someone mentioned QuarkXPress, I'm
I
going,
know. Can you remember?
is it still alive?
Yeah.
Or it's
Strange.
Yeah. It's still around.
Newspaper publishers use it a lot, don't they? I think, David. Is that right?
Do they?
I believe so. Yeah, that's why it's still around, and it's and we have a license for it at ArtCenter. We have.
No.
We do. We just haven't installed it.
I wonder why, you know, but bringing back what Jason was railing about, it's true. The use or understanding of variable fonts by the designer outside of web is going to be difficult until the tools are built into Adobe InDesign. In terms of, I know they've talked about it.
Well, we're built in well.
Well,
I mean,
yes,
they're there,
yes.
they exist. They're just not great.
Right.
And, you know, Adobe, you know, the type is like a tiny few % of Adobe's business. And until consumers are beating down the door saying this has to work, it lags. It's really unfortunate and frustrating, but it takes a lot of collective effort to move that ship. Thankfully, there are a bunch of people working on it, but it's gonna take a while, I think, sadly.
Right. It's a big ship, as Rachel Elnar saying. It's a big ship to move,
Yeah.
as is any large company. So what would you say if you were to criticize variable fonts right now and how you're using it? What do you think you see as improvements that are needed, whether from whichever point of view, from design, from types of fonts that should be designed? I think we had that question too from someone about.
There's sort of two sides to it. One, I wish more type designers working on variable fonts would pay attention to the specs, because it hurts adoption.
Oh, that's you, Greg.
So there's a couple of specifics there, because it is a purposely open format, but there are a few things that you're supposed to be able to hang your hat on. On a weight axis, your whatever you say is regular should map to 400. Anywhere between 100 and 1,000, but 400 should be regular. The rest of it is up to you. A width axis, again, could be anywhere from 1 to 1,000, but 100 is supposed to be the normal width. And that stuff gets missed all the time, and it makes it harder to then use those things on the web. The reason why, if we have those standards on the web, a web browser will, by default, if you say nothing else, just use this font, it will show you the 400 weight. And so if you've set up your weight axis to go from 1 to 500, 400 is probably going to be pretty bold. And absent knowing that and rewriting your CSS to redefine normal, then it's going to look really weird. I got one font from Monotype that had a width axis that went from 3 to 5. What does that mean? It's 3 to 5%. I mean, it's supposed to be 100 is normal. So these things do work. You can still use it, but you make it harder for people. And every time you put up a barrier where things behave vastly differently from one font to the next, you make it harder to adopt. So that's on the normalization side. And then going completely in the other direction is I think we're not being creative enough. I think we're still thinking about variable fonts as an evolution of an existing known thing, rather than like what the Underwear guys are doing and reimagining writing in the first place. And so I think we need both of those things to give life to the format and really help create interest and adoption. It's an evolution and a revolution all at the same time.
Robin, you have a question. You can unmute and ask. Oh.
Hi, I'm in Vancouver. I teach at Emily Carr. I have a question about accommodating multimodal or multi-orthographic layouts with variable fonts. So, for example, if I'm thinking specifically of languages that have very few fonts available to them, so like a lot of indigenous dialects don't have very many fonts. Is there already existing material on potential for accommodating? So maybe I'll just give an example. I'm thinking of a very specific dialect, and within that community, there will be people who are new to learning the dialect and people who are already comfortable with the dialect if it's expressed in syllabics, and that those syllabics will be different from one another. Then there are also people who prefer to use Roman orthography to express the same language. So it's complicated in terms of getting people to download multiple fonts, or it can be a barrier to communication, especially on social media. So that's a very broad question, but do you have any information where I could find out more about that?
Yes and no. So the Noto project that Google, Monotype, and Adobe, it was a bunch of people working on this, and essentially that one family supports, as far as I know, every writing system on the planet that has a font.
I would also say IBM Plex too.
Yeah, there are a few, and they keep growing. But I was thinking specifically of like First People languages in Canada. There are so many, and there are so few fonts. where I think what you would end up with there is, because of these different, you're essentially trying to present it in different languages, but it's the same language just represented differently, either in sort of native symbols or Roman sort of map to it. Those are different Unicode code points. So you are really effectively presenting it in more than one language, which you can do rather easily on the web, and then serve a different font for either one of those. So they take Noto and they break it up into different font files. So you're not trying to serve one thing to everybody. You could actually subset to what you need for different languages, and then based on a language option that somebody chooses, serve the correct font to them. So, I mean, there are a few steps to it, but that's actually one of the things that we're working on. I'm also an invited expert on the W3C's web font working group. And one of the things that, well, really the thing that we're working on at the moment is how to progressively serve fonts on the web so that you don't have to download the whole thing. And it's specific. One of the main applications is for languages like CJK, or in your case, the corners of the world language space that are not often served, but might be part of a larger whole. And so the idea is, with this technology on the web enabled on a server, it would only download the characters needed to render that page rather than the whole font. And then as you go from one page to the next, it will just keep adding to that font the characters needed to render each subsequent page. So it makes it much more possible to support a massive number of different languages without having to get into that scenario of like downloading a CJK typeface that's 20 megabytes to render, 200 glyphs. So that is something that's probably still a year or two away from being in production on the web, but it is very much aimed squarely at helping solve some of those problems. It doesn't address the number of typefaces, but if there's a reliable way to use it on the web, that will help sort of create a reason for more of those fonts to exist. So it's kind of like this chicken and egg sort of thing. You have to be able to use it in order to create the market, and that's what I've tried to do in a lot of my efforts in the last couple of years is to help try and create that market on the web to help drive it around to print. But it's kind of the same problem that we're trying to solve. So not really a complete answer, but it might help guide you towards some ways to solve it.
What about, and Robin, this goes also to your concerns, maybe addressing, and I know Shani might know more about this too, when you're dealing with multi-script types, it's the same consideration, when you all of a sudden are doing variable fonts. Have you found that's something that is becoming difficult, or is it harder to do multi-script in variable?
Yeah, I see people doing it. So I know like Weil Marcos does some amazing stuff in Arabic in variable form. Sahar Afshar and Juan Soleil have done some incredible talks showing stuff in Arabic where the variable axis is the Kashida. And so for copy fitting or pacing and reading, so it really can help shape the way that text is represented. I don't know enough about it. I actually just recently picked up some books on typesetting in Chinese to just try and understand these things a little bit better, like what is good typography in other languages. But I don't understand it well enough. But I think there, Robin, did you have a follow-up question that?
No, I think that part of what you're talking about in a broader sense is sort of like an actual shift that takes place from print that I think maybe hasn't taken place yet. It sounds like that's what you're saying. Like even the logic that we're employing is still print-based, and I am a print designer. So that, for example, you've answered a question that I've wondered about for a while, which is why it's so easy for me to find glyphs online if I type it into like Google search, but it's really difficult if I get into InDesign. It becomes really clunky and I have to download different fonts and yeah, so sorry, I'll mute myself. Thank you.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right.
I think, Robin, you asked some very interesting questions. How do you work with this within what you're familiar with as an educator, right? And so don't mute yourself, continue the conversation. I mean, that's the whole point, you know. I'm sorry if I interrupted too. I thought you were really talking more towards when you're dealing with something that is not a Latin language too, and you're trying to deal with, it's hard enough, not even in variable fonts, but in, you know, non-variable fonts to accommodate.
Oh, sorry, I'm gonna just, and I don't want to take up everybody's time, but just, it's hard. I haven't figured out a short form, and so I'm just gonna do my best, but I'm also a grad student, and I'm looking at ways to accommodate non-Roman orthography and Roman orthography in the same, same location, but also speaking to what Jason is talking about what good typesetting would actually look like. And it's complicated because I'm used to Roman orthography, where I can look at sort of like pre-existing information and treat that as a map. And in this case, I'm more trying to take information, not take information, but I'm trying to just come up with a way to talk about it in a classroom environment in which people are coming from a lot of different orthographic traditions together. So it's like a totally different challenge.
Well, I think it's a real.
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say it's a gap for me. I haven't known where to look to learn how to take my own understanding of typography and what I have come to learn and think about as good or not, and find that parallel for Chinese typography or Japanese or Arabic, or there's not at least as much that I've found in English that can help me learn these things about other languages. And I'm guessing that's part of the challenge there. It's a gap if anyone wants to work on it.
Me, I'm trying to work on it.
Can I just add something? Robin, I teach a fairly group of students some of who are English speakers only and from the UK, but others are not from the UK, and they speak English. They're just learning it while they're studying. Others are bilingual, but their first language isn't English. And a lot of them use non-Latin, so they'll use Arabic, or they'll use Cyrillic as a base script form or something like that. So one of the projects I do in the third year with them is get them to design a campaign, political campaign, using mixing non-Latin and Latin script. They can choose what the campaign is and what the script is, and it forces and getting them to start the typography from the non-Latin, not from the Latin, because often when you see non-Latin interpretations of logos, for example, the bias is towards the Latin form, and the non-Latin has to bend to work with the Latin form. So getting to think in that way. Now, I don't know, I mean, I'm crap at languages, but I can tap into the students. I can get them, so some of them, one speaks and writes Arabic, another one speaks and writes Hebrew, somebody else is a bit familiar with Devanagari, for example. Somebody else knows a bit about Bengali. Other people know a bit. Someone's grandmother was Armenian, which has got its own script. And get them to bring that to the session and just let go of the idea that I need to know everything, because I can't possibly know that. And further, I can't mark it either. I can't mark it from a technical point of view. I can't say that's brilliant rendition of Devanagari. I can read it perfectly because I have no idea. But I can get them to make sure they test it. I can get them to follow a rigorous process. I can get them to think about pure formal consistency and a sort of integrity of drawing. So trying to research how these forms originally arrived at now their kind of core shapes, which usually comes from the tool that they were first drawn in or were traditionally drawn in, and get them to work through a kind of process, and let go of the idea that I am marking this final piece of work, because the final piece of work seems to me to be not that good. And actually in doing the project, I found some really great resources. And one I had to mention, you might know this, is, do anyone know Cat Books? Lady who publishes this imprint, KHATT Books. She publishes typography excellent typography pieces in the Arabic world, and she's trying to. Sorry, it's KHAWT books.
Thank you, David. You can type it in for everyone.
Yeah, sorry.
Instead of holding it up to the screen.
This one's about unified Arabic, which was an interesting project to make Arabic work for mechanical typesetting. But she's got loads of publications and there's very vibrant community around it. But there are others, of course, as well. But anyway, so I'll stop talking.
I would also add that search through the ATypI archives on YouTube from past talks, and there have been a lot of really fascinating talks done about combining scripts with Roman type forms. There was a fantastic one from ATypI in Tokyo about combining Hangul Korean with Roman letter forms, and looking at all of those considerations and hearing that from the perspective of a native speaker of that language is really illuminating. So whether you can like tap into your students or anything, I think unless you are a really as close to a native speaker as possible, then you're not going to have the same perspective. And that's, again, that's where
we'll also send you Robin. We did a show, remember in Tokyo, Jason, of Mike Sierra Tango on multiscript typefaces. And we have a catalog. Oh God, do we have enough to send to everyone in this group? We'll be glad to, Susan and Clifford would know. I can hold this up too. See, just like this. We have a lot. Yeah. You can't see it because, here it is. So we'll send this to you, Robin. And
that would be great.
It really covers a lot of, from smaller foundries to the larger foundries, the development from Roman to multiscript, and how they really want to look at the character of the typeface design remains the same from Roman through Devanagari. So it's about consistency of the design of the type as you would say, the glyphs change from language to language.
Yeah, I have quite a few lectures prepared already talking about these things, and I so appreciate people mentioning it. And I don't want to derail the conversation too much from what your source was, but just to mention that Tengiz Type, which specializes in Nepalese type and doing branding for Chinese, like through China, is really helpful. And also, I'm not meaning to spam, and I hope it's okay for me to put this in here, but
Please do.
I typed up all the information that was given to me orally about typesetting Cree when I was designing children's books.
Oh, cool.
So I'm just going to put it there because Cree, I think I can't find a lot written online about it. And I think it's really lovely to hear that everybody has like so many different sources that I've never even heard of. It indicates that there's so much interest in this. My issue is largely just figuring out the technical tools that I could offer. Like, I think Hangul got a boost from OpenType, was my understanding, in terms of people's ability to work with it. So anyway, I'm really just so grateful for everybody.
Thank you.
I also want
to send it out to everyone.
I want to call out that Stephen Coles contributed that there's a fonts in use category of stuff that uses more than one writing system. So check the chat there. But if you go to fonts in use and look for multiscript, then you'll find a lot more examples. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, but so getting back, I was going to talk about variable types here.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Hi, Jamie Stark from LCAD. Jason, you're in your lecture earlier. It seemed like implementation was always happening through CSS. Is there like sort of broad accessibility through CMS systems and stuff support happening for variable type? I'm a little bit of a neophyte when it comes to web design and coding, and just trying to understand how I can use this and implement this.
Well, so there are a few different interesting developments there. Now, because it's implemented through CSS, just like other web fonts are, there's small differences in syntax, but otherwise you can use them anywhere. And because many platforms like Squarespace or Webflow will allow you to put in a link to the Google fonts that you want, you could use the Google Fonts API to get variable fonts. So there are lots of possibilities. I also heard, I haven't gone back to look at it, but I think in the latest release of WordPress, one of their core themes uses variable fonts. So there are a few different ways to start to use them. And I think that it's well worth it to learn the basics of how to implement them, because you can find them to use on GitHub and in other places with some of the resources that I put in my slides, as well as some starters to get you going, to give like a project that you can play with on your own. So I think there's no substitution really for starting to get a handle on writing a little bit of the CSS yourself, but it will open up a lot of doors for you to experiment.
So I have a question for Greg. Greg, how difficult do you think it would be when someone's first learning font design if you immediately had them think or design a variable font? Think of it not as what had been taught about font design, the different weights, and you design one, maybe the Roman weight, and then you might do the bold, and then you might do italic. How difficult do you think that would be to immediately set them on the path of variable font design?
Well, I think, kind of to my earlier comment is there's no substitution for kind of orientating yourself around the general grammar of things. You just can't. I mean, glyphs is not a problem to learn. You just can't step into it and look up a tutorial on multiple masters and then go at it. I mean, you can, but you will run into some significant issues right off the bat. But again, I think it's you have to have that basic sense, and then I think it's again, I think there's no, like, everyone understands the idea of a family. It's not some, right? And especially if they're coming into font design with, typography, all the way up to typography 4 under their belt. They get it, right? You don't necessarily need to over re-emphasize these things. You can, with a bit of, like I said, a little bit of like kind of just jumping back, kind of getting the orientation, you can immediately kind of set them on their way. But you can only set them on their way if there's a certain criteria that they're trying to meet. Why are you doing this? Like, if it's just about, hey, I want to have this, that's not, in my opinion, enough, because there's going to be so many points in the process where you have to reflect and you have to evaluate why is this needed, why is that needed. But I think, hopefully I'm answering your question. I think you can get to it quickly. I think as in teaching font design, you do need to get to it quicker. I think, it's different in a graduate program where that you're going there. You're going to KVK or Reading, and you are in that only, right? But in an undergrad program, font design is an elective. Not every institution even has it at an undergrad capacity. And when they take it as an elective, they've got a number of other things going on. So in a font design 1 course, I think there isn't enough time. But in a font design 2 course, they're more than willing and primed, ready to take that forward. And then I would argue, well, that's why the necessity in an undergrad program, why a font design 2 course is needed, because that's where they can explore all that and can be and should be encouraged at that level. So
I think as soon as somebody gets past the first instance, as soon as you start to think about weight or width or some other variation, I mean, I say weight because that's probably one of the most common, or perhaps slant. As soon as you start to design more than one, that's the point at which it's worth exploring. Could I do this as a variable font? Because that's, and this is coming from a non-type designer, so take that for what it's worth. But if you have something where you have a regular weight and you want to design a heavier one, you're creating two masters. And so you have the option there at that point to say, I would like to explore the continuum in between, or I want to just do these two specific things. But that's where the software is now getting to the point where now you have an export option. You can try it out and experiment and see what happens.
Yeah, and in teaching font design too at ArtCenter, I mean, part of the program is that you are working with multiple weights or family members, and most of the time the student comes to it with a pretty traditional aspect. They're working on a book font and they want a bold, right? They want very practical things, and occasionally someone enters in that class, and moreover they're looking at another class that they're working on, and they want to support what they're doing in that other class, which is actually one of the more preferred ways of working, in my opinion, because it's immediately giving them sense of purpose, and it immediately opens up the box of possibility, but still manages it. So they don't necessarily need to be working in a traditional, quote unquote, traditional manner. We could be saying, well, what do you want to do this with? And it can be, well, I want it to support this in this platform, this platform, this platform. It's like, okay, this sounds like a really prime specimen to do something variable, to have definitely go beyond the weight axes, but introduce width, introduce slant, do things like that. Unfortunately, we're limited with time again. It's not an excuse. It's just, but even with the limitation of time, it's stressed actually in both courses that the instruction is just kind of setting you on your way. This is very short amount of time to actually complete what you need to complete. So at least, let's say someone was investigating the variable nature that type could do for his project. But again, just enough time, but ensuring that that student was set up so that the issue of time, once it was freed from being in a class and meeting the requirement and the other requirements of the term, they could keep facilitating because they knew enough, right? They knew enough, and they knew the technology, and they ironed out all the purposes and everything. And so, I think
that's really the heart of it, is thinking about the purpose, and really we have to do that as designers at every step. So, starting from the logical sort of conclusion of the implementation of this thing is, I would like to have this typeface that I can use to set a book or a reading-centric web page. What are the things that I need to be able to do? Mm-hmm. I need to be able to provide emphasis. I need to set things apart. I might want to use it in different sizes in different ways, and work backwards from there. If you were designing a typeface for that, what are the characteristics that you need? So that way you do have a purpose for it, and it gives you some direction, and you can figure out, I can start with this, and then I want to move in these other directions and expand upon it over time. And I think that gives you much clearer guidance than simply saying, I want to make something and then figure out what to do with it. Yeah. And, they're very different approaches, but anything that's in the design should be there for a reason. And same thing holds true for the typeface and how you're applying it.
Yeah. And I think also, like, this idea of what's expected. So as someone enters into font design too, they're much more serious about designing type. It's no longer a class or just a dabble. They're pretty serious at that point. Now, are they going to want to be a type designer? Not necessarily as their sole thing, but they're definitely having their eye on what it takes to publish a font, what it takes to do it on your own or shop it around, and getting into that idea of, like, not only is there the functional aspects that are necessary from kind of the view as the type designer, but what are the expectations from the user? You know, you can't, if you're just going to roll out with a single weight font, that, you know, that the expectation is going to be pretty narrow, right? Or the use. But if, you know, if you're thinking, I think to your point, Jason, you know, I really want a book type. Well, it's just regular's not going to cut it. That's like, you're going to need the other. So the thing is they're also working under the impression that this isn't just for them now. They're working under the impression that they're creating a tool for others, but they're creating a product essentially. And what is the expectation of that product? So another designer purchases that product. What are they thinking about? Because, you know, they're going to want those things. And then as now that we are moving, you know, evolving into how we get information, how we design information, that idea around variability is no longer novelty, or it hasn't been for a while, but it's actually becoming part of the expectation. And, you know, again, it's forcing them to look on the other side of things as well. So,
So picking up on that and the question that Rachel just asked in the chat, I think it's good to, I think, relate this back to as programs and as teachers and as practitioners. It is often talked about, we're teaching design fundamentals and the implementation will, you know, the student will figure that part out. This really takes that to a much further degree. When you have this much variability and you have this many screen sizes, I'm coming back to Rachel's point of like, what is appropriate on a given device for text size, for example.
Yeah, and relation to distance from the face too.
There is some research into how this stuff came about. The reason why all desktop browsers standardize on what is nominally referred to as a 16 pixel or reference pixel size of text is that the average distance between you and a monitor screen is a little bit longer than the length of your arm, which is why we have this research aiming towards 12-point type being appropriate reading size for most people based on average arm length. I mean, it's a bunch of very fuzzy and grand assumptions going in there, but that gives us a starting point. What I will typically advise people is, what that means on desktop browsers is you say the font size is 100%. So 100% will render text physically roughly the same thing across all desktop devices. It's going to change on mobile devices. Mobile devices, a lot of the device manufacturers have done their own research into deciding what is a nominally average text size for reading on that device. So if you say 100% and look at it on an iPhone versus an older iPhone to an Android device, a Firefox phone, if you ever ran across one of those, it's all slightly different physically, but it is meant to be appropriate to the quality of that screen and that device. So I lean into that. I say, leave your body copy sized at 100%. And if you use specifically 100% and then base in M's or REMs from that, then whatever the device manufacturer has said is a good readable text size is the starting point, and you're building your proportion and scale up and down from there. That way, on every other device, it might shift slightly, but the proportion will remain the same. So again, it's like this abstract notion of it's not 12-point and 36. It's a relationship between those two sizes. And so I think this carries along with everything that we've been talking about, whether it's the design of the font itself, you know, or anything else. We can't know everything, so we have to lean into some things that are handled for us and then build a system around that. Because we also have this wonderful equalizer, and we have this articulating thing that is holding our device and it's getting nearer our face or farther away. So that's the correction for an individual that we can't know about. My eyes are not as good as yours, so I will hold it closer, or I'll have my progressive lenses and I'll hold it down here instead of up here, you know.
Rachel, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So two things, if I can remember. Well, first of all, in terms of distance, I mean, if there's any resources that we can refer to, because sometimes we have a client base or an audience that we know is like over 50. So what is, you know, if there's any best practices for sizes versus type, you know, an audience that we have that are younger, whatnot.
Well, I tend to go back to stick with the 100%, but what I've started to do and see other people doing a bit more is actually building size controls into the UI.
Yeah.
Because they do that in book readers, and then people make the choice. Because, you know, I'm 49. My eyes are generally fine for reading on screens, but on my phone, it's a little different. So it's going to vary from every single person who's doing that. So while you might find some academic research out there, I'm not certain how universal it will be. I think it's more important to know what the differences will be. And those are going to be around contrast, spacing, and size. And those are all things that we can build into the UI to let the person decide for themselves.
I think Dalton Mag has been doing a lot of work, or at least I know, Bruno Mag has been doing a lot of work on accessibility and mobility. So you might want to check with them. I know he's talked a lot about exactly this, how the design of fonts and variable fonts affect, you know, different populations, Rachel. So you might want to, check with them, check with.
And my second question is, when you say 100%, does that mean the students should be like taking a look at like material design documentation to figure out what are the difference? No. Okay.
I'm sorry. That was a very flippant response, but that is very much a weak point in the material design system specifically. So no offense, Google, but like that is not the strong suit. When I say 100%, I mean like that's in the CSS, font size 100% on the HTML element, and then everything kind of builds from there. I have not found a lot of good design systems in the public domain that handle typography really well. I'm trying to make more of that available, but yeah, that's tough. It's really hard to find ones that handle device and user specific flexibility. But I think if you study a little bit, Sophie Beyer writes a lot of really great stuff about how the eyes work and how we can see, how we see letter forms. I would definitely check into her presentations and her books. And then once you have that understanding of what are the things that change, this macular degeneration, you lose the ability to notice contrast. So you need a stronger differentiator. You might have to change the type size. For people who have dyslexia and might suffer from crowding, spacing is a big issue. I've included a demo and some talks about that, and I actually had somebody with dyslexia come up to me after I gave one of those talks, and she said, you know, I didn't even know I had this problem until you all of a sudden spaced the stuff out and I could read what you had on screen. Yeah. I mean, it floored me because it was interesting in the abstract, and I actually learned about it from an A-Type-I talk from Kevin Larson from Microsoft. So I had included it in there, kind of, it's like, I think this is something you should think about. But it was very real to her, and it actually taught her something about her own brain and how it was working a little bit differently. So those controls are all really standard bits in CSS. We just have to think about how those work, and then that relates back to how you code it. So somebody had asked earlier about size units. M's or rems are relative to themselves, essentially, and those will resize better than a fixed pixel size. There are certain things about user preferences in browsers that will break if you use pixels. So some things will work and other things will work really badly. But if you always end up in that relative unit, which we can fix that in like a development tool, and then you end up with a more flexible UI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
thank you.
No, sure.
Any more questions from anyone else? We're getting close to we're getting close to the finish line here. So
Not, I have one more. Just
I knew, Rachel.
I'm so sorry.
No, I agree. See, I think
screen design.
See, I think this is fascinating. I think the subject of accessibility is actually very important. And I know some people had asked questions earlier in the modular about designing and use of variable fonts for accessibility. I think it's a huge issue, you know, in terms of population. So, but go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah. So, I mean, I teach mainly design students, not coding. And so is there a way to demonstrate for them what the best type sizes are for screen? I know that some of them are, you know, developing responsive or for multiple breakpoints, but without talking about coding, is there any resources?
It's really hard to do that without talking about code in some way. But I think what's important is to stress things in proportion so that the specifics can change from one device to the next. And so, you know, by not locking yourselves into, I made this mock-up in Illustrator and these are the point sizes that I chose, you have to get away from that. That is I think it is the hardest thing for us as designers. I hung on to this for years. And eventually I started just using math instead. And that way the relationship would preserve, but I stopped getting hung up on that. And it's really important that when you do that, then you can let everything else move. And so what works quite often when people zoom the page in a browser, it is actually changing the way the browser thinks the resolution is, so it will trigger breakpoints just as, so that's actually a good thing for someone with real vision challenges. If they've got low vision and they want to zoom the page, we know the layout's going to work because we designed it to work on a phone and a tablet. And so that's where the responsive design aspect comes together. And by using those relative units, we can lean into that and let the device and the user sort it out. And we just give it a system.
Great, that makes sense. The challenge will be just getting my students to love math, or do math.
Yeah, it's getting a little bit better. I mean, I don't know if you remember some of the talks that I've given over the last couple of years, this massive hairy formula in the middle that I was using to scale the typography. The CSS is getting better and it's getting smarter and shorter, and like one small line of CSS can handle a lot of that complexity now. So those things come along. And there was a question from Grant, or an observation really, in the chat about things like reading speed. So, you know, we talk about everything that we're doing, but there's stuff that the device can do too. So there have been some interesting experiments in text size based on camera feedback and proximity. That I think tends to work badly. But being able to tap into how people are, when are they scrolling? Giving you an indicator of how fast they're reading. You know, might that be a way to adapt typography in a more meaningful way to help people, like, do a test, like read this way, now scroll, we're going to adjust some things and we're going to see, like, find your best reading setting. Like, that would be a fascinating use of machine learning to help somebody find their own best system. And that is a huge accessibility win.
Yeah.
It could be.
Could be. And that's, again, going back to eventually, whether it's variable fonts or just designing of fonts, that's where I think machine-based learning is going to go. The machine is going to start learning how you interact with it. It's come to the close, and I have to ask, who is the furthest? Who is here from the furthest point from Los Angeles? I know, David, you're in the UK. Shani, unfortunately, Shani, you're not in Israel, are you? You are? No. Sorry, because I always like to give this swag that we have for our breakout sessions to someone who has come here from the furthest. Svetlana, where are you located? She has to unmute.
West Hollywood.
Oh, Svetlana. So I think
maybe we should ask Zen where she is right now.
Who?
Zen. Yeah.
Zen?
Zen is the
From
first.
India.
Zen.
Yeah.
Zen, that's right.
We have a winner.
We
Yeah.
have a winner. And Zen, you're besides everyone getting the Mike Sierra Tango catalog, then you get to get these wonderful specimen package from, thank you, Greg Lindy.
Oh, thank
Oh,
you.
Lux
That
Typo.
is so good. I think this would be amazing to share with my kids.
Yes. And thank you, Greg. I mean,
Thank you, Greg.
yes.
My pleasure.
And
Thank you.
we'll throw in a few more things from the HMCT for you there.
Oh,
okay?
thank you so much.
And David, you've been to HMCT and you've gotten a lot of things from us, so that's okay.
My house is full of stuff. I need to get rid of, chuck half of it away, not quite. Thanks, Gloria.
But Zen, we'll be glad to send you
I'm so happy. I'm so glad that I woke up till 1:30 midnight.
Well, thank you. That means a lot.
Well, and thank you again, everyone. The reason we had the variable font discussion today is because the next module, starting in 2 hours, right, Rachel, is on transmedia design and transmedia typography, which is what Jason demonstrated when, what is the platform that you have to design in? And this is where variable fonts are really going to be quite effective, whether it's from print to screen to experiential to exhibit design. And so that's in 3 hours. So I hope if you're still around, if you're still up, Zen, you might as well just stay the night, right? And
I should just stay.
Just stay. Why? I go to sleep. But I want to thank everyone for joining us in the breakout. And thank you, Jason. Thank you, Greg. I know this can go on, and we'll talk to Jason about developing a class specifically for,
I would love to do that.
For teachers.
Yes.
Not the general. Yes. How do we do the shift now? How do we teach this? You know,
I'm looking forward to hearing from more of you about how you're teaching now.
Right.
So how can we take that and just and tweak the dials a little bit to just make it an easier transition? Because I think that's the key, is to fit this into how you're already teaching, not to necessarily upend the apple cart and start over. Okay. If you go to my website, rwt.io, and look under tips, all of the newsletters that I've written over the last year or so about web typography are all there. So there's tons of resources for you to look at different design techniques and how you might implement them on the web, with tons of sample code and projects and things for you to play with. So if you're interested in any of this, there's loads more there. And then you're welcome to sign up for the newsletter as well.
Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you, everyone. If I do, I'll see you in 2 more hours.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Gloria.